Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Kim Ricketts and I manage along with Kirsten Wiley the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Today we have someone here to continue our ongoing conversations that we have with ourselves and each other daily and continuously about traffic. It consumes much of our time and our conversations and our psyche. Why, for example, why are all of the other people on the road such terrible drivers? Why don't we have any real transit here yet? Why don't bicyclists have to obey the same rules that we do? Why does the bridge shut down over a nice sunset on Mount Rainier? Tom Vanderbilt is here to help us. He won't get us mass transit, but he will explain after much research and study why we drive the way we do, and it's not actually a reasonable or pretty picture. In fact, Tom has found the stories and math and, well, some kind of science is behind everything from accidents to parking psyche, and in fact, there's an unbelievable amount of information about why we drive and why it all doesn't work so well. Tom Vanderbilt writes on design, technology, and science and culture for many publications, including Wired, Slate, Gourmet, The Wall Street Journal, Popular Science, and many more. He is contributing editor of Design Magazine's ID and Print, and while he's here to talk to us about traffic today, keep in mind he has to leave here by 3:30 to get across that parking lot they call the 520 Bridge. So please join me in welcoming Tom Vanderbilt.
Just thinking I should... Sorry, is there a plug? I don't want to lose power halfway through.
Oh, you power plug? Yeah, I'll make it.
Anyway. Quick question. Are we all drivers? Show of hands? Or average or better than average drivers? Show of hands? Okay. All right. So, and that's a classic experiment that has been done many different places, many different people. 90% of the room will say better than average driver, and sort of one of the fascinating dynamics that plays out on the road. Oops, sorry. Is there anyone here also who's worked with Microsoft Traffic with INRIX out of curiosity? Or okay, so I'm not really going to talk about any of that, but curious to talk more. So I'm mostly a design writer, and I'm really obsessed with things like book jackets, and I think they do a great job of pulling out some of the essential qualities of a book. In this case, I want to refer to a couple of versions of Traffic that are being published abroad. First, the British cover. We know the British are stereotypically known for being a bit more reserved, a bit more intellectual, and this certainly comes across in the jacket design. But seriously, this book jacket expresses in a nice way the incredibly individualistic side of traffic and how the roads throw together people from different walks of life, religions, classes, races, basic levels of mental stability. And I suppose it also kind of suggests that we rather turn into animals on the road. Now, the next cover comes via the Dutch, who I've often found to have a very quirky sense of humor. In this case, we're not individuals, but a flock of sheep, or perhaps sheeple, as they like to say on talk radio. This view, in my opinion, is radically different, but no less true. Traffic also works as a system, a grouping in which we're all more or less anonymous, and arguably it works better that way. Human traffic, say the specialists I've spoken to in what's called collective animal behavior, is not so different from all kinds of mobility found in nature, including particularly ant traffic. Ants who begin new commutes through new territories each day lay pheromones on the trails they construct, thus sending detailed instructions, signals if you will, to the ants behind them. They're very good at harmonizing their traffic flow, even recruiting extra ants to carry heavy objects so the collective speed varies as little as possible on the trails. Our behavior in what's called car following, and this is something that took decades to actually get modeled down, or essentially the complex way we react to the presence of a car ahead of us in traffic, is not so different to those pheromones being put out on the trail. But where ants are truly cooperative, we have individual desires. This is from Shanghai. And there's a constant tension in traffic between that individual desire and action and what's best for the system. It was the disconnect between the two that actually got me started on this whole project a few years ago. But in this case, what I thought was best for the entire system, what I thought was doing was best for, start over. In this case, the behavior I thought was best for everyone was actually the opposite way. It was all a little bit more complicated. You've no doubt all had the experience of driving on the highway when suddenly, you see one of these, usually with some vague instruction like merge right 1 mile. For as long as people did anything but walk, merging traffic has created challenges. Engineers have responded by creating rules and systems, sometimes good, sometimes confusing. In the ruins of Pompeii, the traffic archaeologist Eric Poehler has analyzed the wear patterns on curbstones, among other things, to figure out how things like right-of-way were assigned in the days of carts and chariots. Whatever the systems created, merging, studies have shown, is one of the most stressful things we experience in driving. In fact, the idea people might have difficulty in yielding one's way to another on wheels has a fairly long history, as this 18th century painting by Claude Gillot shows. It's arguably a case of Renaissance road rage going on here. But returning to the modern highway, most of us, I imagine, do what I typically did. You look for an opening and quickly get over. But often, as the lane you're in creeps to a slow halt, you might notice with a certain hostility that cars in the lane you have vacated continue to speed ahead out of sight. You quietly seethe and contemplate returning to the much faster left lane, if only you could find an opening. You grimly accept your fate and curse the human condition. Some people, like truckers, get so angry they block both lanes. One day I decided I'd had enough. If this rings any bells, I hope it does. And so I rashly did the opposite. Seized by some sudden impulse, when I saw the sign, lane ends 1 mile, merge right, I plowed ahead, oblivious to the hostile stares of other drivers. After passing dozens of cars, I made it to the bottleneck point where, filled with newfound swagger, I took my rightful turn in the small, somewhat alternating zipper merge that had formed. I merged and it was clear asphalt ahead. My heart was beating faster. My wife covered her face with her hands. In the days after, I felt guilty and confused. Was I wrong to have done this, or had I been doing it wrong all my life? When I asked friends about it, most seemed to think that what I had done was the wrong thing, that merging early was polite and efficient, and that what I did was making things worse. Essentially, I was part of the reason driving in America has become so unpleasant. One writer, an executive in a business magazine, claimed to have had exactly the opposite experience as me. Until very recently, I was a late merger, he wrote. Why had he become a born-again early merger? Because I came to realize that traffic flowed faster the sooner people merged. He used this as a metaphor for successful team building in corporate America, in which late mergers were people who were those who consistently put their own opinions and motives above the greater company. Early mergers could help push companies, he wrote, to their maximum communal speed. But it got me to thinking, did traffic actually flow faster the sooner people merged, or did it seem more noble to think that it did? It struck me that despite the sense of moral righteousness people seem to have on the subject, no one really seemed to know the right answer. And so I took a deeper look. It turns out the answer is much more complex than you might think. I don't want to overwhelm you with the details, but trials involving different kinds of experimental merging systems have shown that not only does so-called early merging not move traffic through bottlenecks any faster, but that systems for late merging, that supposed symbol of individual greed, were actually able to move 15% more traffic through the work zone than conventional merging. My whole worldview about merging was wrong. I then began to wonder what else in traffic I had been wrong about. In any case, my goal was to peer under the hood of this everyday phenomenon, traffic, and it took me everywhere from driving simulators at Toyota in Japan, to traffic reporters' planes in Los Angeles, to the chaotic flow of motorbikes on the streets of Hanoi, to the careening auto rickshaws of Delhi. And yes, I was standing while taking that photograph, and yes, I theoretically did have the right of way, and yes, they obviously went around me. I was not killed. But to return to the idea of what's best for the individual and what's best for the system. As a system, traffic has been compared to water, and the language with volumes and flows seems to suggest that. But a more apt comparison might be what's called granular media. These are solids like cereals or rice that can act like liquids, but are actually solids that can be explosively unpredictable. In traffic, which is a nonlinear system, minor hiccups can produce tremendous effects. Take, for example, this colossal traffic jam that was captured by Google Earth on the day the satellites passed over Belgium. What catastrophic conflagration could have caused this county-wide queue? You see the beginning is down there, and is at the top. When you look a little bit more closely, it seems actually not that much at all. A stalled car, a slight fender bender. One curious phenomenon that emerges when you begin to look at traffic as a system is that slower can actually be faster. The Washington State DOT actually held a contest for ways to describe this to the public in an easy-to-understand manner. The winner, a science writer named Paul Haas, suggested a simple metaphor, rice. Here's the idea. Take 2 cups of rice, pour 1 quickly through a funnel into a beaker. Then do the same with the second cup, but pour this slowly. It takes longer to actually pour the rice this way, but it actually gets into the bottom of the beaker faster. With that first cup, the rice is exceeding the critical density that allows it to flow through without much friction or conflict. Rice is touching rice, grains are merging, blocking each other, and they're getting hung up. We can see how this applies to the highway in the graph to the left. As a system, the highway seems to have better throughput, around 55 to 60 miles an hour, than at higher speeds, or of course at lower speeds. Now, as individual drivers, we essentially act like grains of rice being poured quickly. We seek to maximize our individual speed and following distance without regard for how that might affect the whole system. The following video, taken from a highway in Cairo, shows what happens when you try to pour too much rice through too quickly. You can see all the hallmarks of congestion here, the backwards propagating shock waves, the oscillating accordion-like stretchings of stop-and-go clusters. People are actually driving into jams, or rather the jams are driving into them. There's a lot of inefficiency generated by the overreactions of braking and accelerating. The closer the cars are spaced, the more severe the shock wave and the longer the effect. Of course, some of this congestion has to do with limited capacity. If the road had twice as many lanes, we might not see these waves. But some of it has to do with traffic joining uninterruptedly from an on-ramp downstream. Essentially, too much rice is being introduced into the funnel. This is why, of course, we have ramp meters in Seattle as well, those traffic lights at the end of highway off-ramps that regulate the oncoming vehicle stream. These are a dreaded sight to the individual driver because they're being asked to wait. Studies show that wait actually feels more onerous when drivers are trapped on the ramp than when stuck in actual traffic. As one engineer put it to me, people ask me, the freeway's flowing, why are you asking me to stop? Her answer was, the freeway's flowing because we're asking you to stop. To avoid drivers from simply driving into jams, into that crowded funnel all at once, variable speed limits have been introduced on England's M25 motorway, amongst other places. These essentially try to slow upstream traffic ahead of congestion, not only to prevent rear-end crashes, but to actually improve the throughput of the system. It seems to take longer to emerge from stopped queues than if drivers had simply arrived at a slower, steadier pace. If you think I might be exaggerating the effects the individual driver can have on traffic shock waves, consider the following clip, which some of you, I imagine, may have seen from researchers in Japan. On a closed track, they instructed a group of drivers to maintain a steady speed of 30 kilometers per hour in a steady distance. There were no physical bottlenecks and no new cars were coming onto the system. But over time, due to simple, almost imperceptible changes in time and headways, or the spacing between vehicles, small clusters start to form. Some vehicles are forced to come to a stop, and waves move backward at a measured speed of 20 kilometers per hour, or about the same as has been observed in actual traffic. The cars on this loop were positioned right on the edge of what's called critical density. Had they been set to autonomously maintain a rigid, unvarying speed and following distance, theoretically they could have rotated in a perfect circle until they ran out of gas. But unfortunately for this experiment, humans were at the wheel. Even the most vigilant driver has trouble maintaining a perfectly constant speed and following distance, which leads to the second main thrust of the book, how traffic as a system is informed by humans at the wheels of cars. Humans are the X factor in traffic. They tend to get in the way of the most perfect traffic schemes. As a paper I saw presented at a traffic conference subtly put it in a telling disclaimer, this model does not account for the heterogeneity of driver behavior. Yes, driver behavior. Unfortunately for traffic, it's made up of a lot of driver behaviors. One reviewer thought the book should be called simply Idiots. I thought that was a bit uncharitable, but led me to wonder, why do people do dumb things on the road, things they wouldn't do at home, at work, in non-vehicular public? I think the two big problems are anonymity and feedback. Consider this following clip from eBay from a commercial with the tagline, "People are good." That's sort of my favorite relevant traffic moment. But many people are good on eBay, but the system thrives on feedback. People who are not good will be rather quickly found out, and the reputation will suffer, and thus their ability to do business. Traffic is essentially like eBay, with a bunch of strangers interacting, mostly politely, but with some bad behavior. If people do misbehave, how will they suffer? If they happen to be spotted by the police, they may be punished, but this is rather random and only captures a fraction of the traffic stream. Imagine if instead of feedback, eBay had to rely on a group of enforcement officers to find violators amidst its millions of daily transactions. So it's been suggested we might consider how's my driving style stickers for everyone. Do something bad, do something good, get feedback via a special number on the fender of your car. Of course, dialing in to complain about someone may pose its own risks, like distracted driving, which I'll return to in a moment. But another reason traffic can feel so non-cooperative is that we typically lack eye contact. Eye contact is one of the most powerful human signals we have. Looking at this picture of the traffic psychologist Ian Walker, something doesn't quite feel right about the image on the left. I don't know if hopefully this carries out a little bit, but the reason is that Walker's eyes are slightly shifted by a matter of a few pixels out of hundreds, and which we can see more closely here. Eye contact, which we can detect powerfully, is an essential tool in gaining cooperation. All kinds of psychological studies show this. In one experiment, a university break room had an honor system for paying for coffee. Above the machine was posted on alternating weeks an image of a flower or eyes. On the weeks the eyes were there, the donations actually soared. We all experience this phenomenon in traffic. On Seinfeld, Jerry knew that when you're trying to merge in New York City, eye contact is essential. We're going to need a human face, he told George. While we're on the subject of eyes, it's a good time to bring up the question of actually what we see on the road and how. I think all of us tend to forget, because our brains do such a good job in fooling us that it's otherwise, that the world we see is not always the world that's out there. This is a JPEG, of course, but appears as it could be a movie file. This comes from a Japanese neuroscientist, and what's actually happening is your eyes are moving. If you look at the black dots, you can concentrate on those, you can stop them from the rotating effect. But another great example of this disconnect was shown in a now famous video by the cognitive psychologist Daniel Simons, again, which some of you may have seen. In this experiment, subjects were asked to count the number of basketball passes made by the group pictured here. Halfway through, someone dressed in a gorilla suit strolled right through the middle of the group as plain as day. He beat his chest, then sauntered off. No way you could miss it, except half of people, including myself, actually did. And this raises the issue of multitasking. I just want to ask everyone here a simple question of what the first car they owned was. And if you do this to someone, watch what happens. Typically their eyes will drift upwards, maybe off to the side. And they're literally searching their memory. It's even thought that moving the eyes helps trigger memory. If you didn't actually move your eyes, you probably winked out inside for a moment. I was in a driving simulator in Massachusetts and was being asked whether certain sentences read to me via a hands-free headset made sense, and then I had to repeat the last word, common psychological experiment. As this clip shows, it didn't work out so well. So, luckily no one was hurt, but you'll note from the eye tracking software, which was that crosshatch, that my eyes were actually right on the road, locked onto the vehicle head. And you find this is what happens with people on cell phones, is they're maintaining a rigid, vigilant look at the car ahead, but whether their mind is fully there is another issue. In essence, though, I didn't see the gorilla in this clip. There's a lot of other things that fool us on the road, even when we think we're paying full attention. Imagine the typical highway. Oh, sorry.
Question.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Is the effect of cell phones? Is using a headset helpful at all?
Should we wait till the end for questions? Or okay, sorry. All right, so imagine a typical highway. How long would you guess the white stripes that divide the lanes are? And how much space would you guess lies between each stripe? When I was first asked this question, I responded, I guess, a bit naively, about 5 feet with maybe 15 feet between the stripes. But we can get a better sense of how long they actually are in this photo, and an even better view here. The exact length does vary, but the U.S. standard calls for 10 feet, although depending on the speed of the road, they may be as long as 12 or 14 feet. In most cases, the stripe is as long as or longer than the cars themselves. The spacing between the stripes is based on a standard 3-to-1 ratio, so for a 12-foot stripe, there will be 36 feet between each stripe. I use this as a simple example of how what we see is not always what we get as we move in the unnaturally high speeds of traffic. It's actually rather amazing that humans can even do things like drive, and I sort of love the middle description, which I do suffer from writer's block, but once in a while I do actually suffer from driver's block, and it's probably what led me to write this book. But given that we're moving at speeds well beyond anything we ever experienced in our evolutionary history, it does beg the question. It's no problem for creatures like the humble pigeon. If you've ever wondered why pigeons on the street seem to wait until the last minute as you approach them, apart from the fact that they're New Yorkers and they're eating pizza, is the reason, as the authors of the Book of Animal Ignorance point out, is that pigeons see 3 times faster than humans. If pigeons were watching a film, they'd need 75 frames a second to see motion. But so how do we drive at high speeds? The short answer, I think, is that we cheat. We make the driving environment as simple as possible with smooth roads, wide roads marked by enormous signs and white markings that are purposely placed far apart to trick us into thinking we're not moving as fast as we are. It's a toddler's view of the world, a landscape of outsized, brightly colored objects and flashing lights with harnesses and safety barriers that keep us from exceeding our own capabilities. If you've ever walked on a highway or even along a busy road, you can get a sense of the curious, almost otherworldly scale of the object. I was recently told in Atlanta that the traffic signals there are 5 feet long and diameter is 12 inches high, which sort of blows my mind, but that's Atlanta. It's a different scale there. But what we see while driving is a visually impoverished view of the world. As Stephen Lee, a vision scientist at the University of Exeter, explains that what matters less is the speed at which we or other things move, but the rate at which images are expanding on the retina of our eyes. In high-speed traffic environments, the retinal speed is actually quite low. Surrounding cars at 80 miles an hour appear not to move at all. But now picture looking down at the road while you're driving at a good speed. It's a blur. This is no less part of the actual environment in which we're driving, but it's beyond our ability to see it with any accuracy. I know you're thinking we don't need to see it to move safely, but I use the example simply to make a point that there are many other ways driving puts our visual and perceptive systems to the test. Have you ever noticed, for example, when you're coming from a rural highway onto a village road with a lower speed limit and it feels absolutely slow? Sometimes engineers even erect signs to tell you something you should basically already know, how fast you're going. The longer we drive at high speeds, the harder it is for us to slow down. It's called speed adaptation. Studies have shown that drivers who drove for the past few minutes at 70 miles an hour drove up to 15 miles per hour faster when they hit a 30 zone than drivers who had not been previously going the higher speed. So what's going on? This clip provides an interesting clue. The goal here is just to stare at the X in the center very carefully, and then if you looked in the right place for the right amount of time, the stationary Buddha should move toward you. This is what's known as the Treadmill Effect. After you've been running for a while on a treadmill and then you stop, you may briefly experience the sensation of moving backwards. What's happening on the highway, similarly to the treadmill, is that neurons in the brain that track forward movement begin to become fatigued as we drive or run at the same speed for a time, staring ahead. When a person stops or slows, the neurons that track backward motion are still effectively dormant, but the now negative output of the forward neurons fools you into thinking you are moving backwards. Or if moving from high speeds to lower speeds, it can fool you into thinking you have slowed more than you actually have, which is why we often see these guys at the entrance to small towns to local roads. Here's another interesting illusion known as the footsteps illusion. This comes from Stuart Anstis, a cognitive psychologist. It looks like these two boxes are moving in shuffling steps when actually they're moving at the same speed. The reason is that contrast affects our perception of speed. The dark box seems to move faster when it crosses the white sections, while the light-colored box appears faster as it crosses the black sections. The higher the contrast, the faster the apparent motion. And what does this have to do with driving? In fog, the contrast of cars, not to mention the surrounding landscape, is reduced. Everything around us appears to be moving more slowly than it is, and we seem to be moving more slowly through the landscape. The idea that we're not even aware of this discrepancy is suggested in studies showing that drivers tend to slightly reduce their speed in foggy conditions, but they don't do so by enough to ensure a safe margin, even when special warning signs have been put up. Drivers may even feel more comfortable staying closer to the vehicle ahead of them so that they do not lose them in the fog, but given the perceptual confusion, this is exactly the wrong move. Similar things happen in the whiteout condition of snow, in which it's not uncommon for drivers to drive into the back of orange-colored snowplow trucks with flashing lights. The culprit is not necessarily slippery roads or poor visibility per se, but low contrast. Drivers may see the back of the truck in time, but they think it is going faster than it actually is, and they may not brake accordingly. And I just wanted to show you one more kind of visual illusion that presents a real problem on the roads. Researchers have long been puzzled about the relatively high number of drivers killed while crossing railroad tracks, typically when visibility was clear and there were functioning warning signals in place. How could a driver not see something as large and loud as a train? Well, one answer is that driver may have simply passed the same set of tracks 300 times in the last year without ever seeing a train. even when the signals were flashing? Did they simply not expect it on the 301st trip across the tracks? This is known as the looked but did not see crash, and the phrase hints at that gap again that can exist between our understanding of the external world and what's actually out there. But there's another problem that this clip shows, which is that we make poor judgments about just how far away an approaching train is. The thing to observe here is that the train doesn't really seem to be drawing any closer until just the last few seconds of its approach. And at higher speeds, we actually can't begin to appreciate the change in viewing angle until what's called the time to collision is incredibly short. There's several reasons we do this. The subtended angle of the train is so small that we can't accurately gauge the distance of the train based on its size until it's quite close, which is also a problem we have when trying to judge the distance of oncoming cars or motorcycles. There's also the problem that we judge large objects to be moving more slowly than, we judge large objects to be moving more slowly than small objects, as any trip to an airport will indicate. Even experienced pilots fall for the illusion that jumbo jets are moving more slowly than smaller airplanes, even though, of course, they're usually not. Airline pilots have been susceptible to another illusion as well. When the Boeing 747 was introduced, pilots seemed to be taxiing too fast. On several occasions, they even damaged the landing gear. Why? The new cockpit was twice as high as the old one, meaning that the pilots were getting half of what's called optical flow at the same speed. They were basically going faster than they thought they were. As this next slide shows, this phenomenon occurs on the road as well. These two photos, which were given to me by a former engineer at General Motors named Leonard Evans, were taken from the exact same distance from the lead car, but the bottom, of course, looks further away. Why? Because the driver is seated higher. The more of the road you can see, the further away objects ahead of you look. Studies have shown that drivers seated at higher eye heights, but not shown a speedometer, will drive faster than those at lower heights. Studies have also shown, perhaps not surprisingly, that SUV and pickup drivers drive at excessive speeds more than others. Might also be why, in my opinion at least, they seem to tailgate more frequently than their cars, but again, that's my opinion. So you're wondering, what can we do to combat all these sorts of illusions? What information can the driver be given? One intriguing approach is known as illusory pavement markings. These are the sort you see in Europe, done by chalk artists. It's not what I'm talking about, but it's a similar idea in a way. We're talking about things like chevrons and other markings whose size or spacings are manipulated to make drivers think they're going faster than they are. This comes from a Minnesota trial that put white dots on the highway to suggest safe tailgating distances, or safe following distances. This led to an unfortunate side effect, however, as someone soon painted a Pac-Man eating the dots. And yeah, I'm just actually going to leave it there, but there's a lot in the book, and I can only cover a fraction without keeping anyone late, but it might be fun to shift to right away to some Q&A. If you'd like to do that. You had a question?
Yeah, given what you said about cell phones, is it effective to use headsets, which is now the law?
Yeah, I mean, there's a minority of studies that find less of an effect, but the majority of things that I've seen basically say there's really no difference in the quality of the conversation. I mean, that's the dialing per se is a 2-second distraction at most, of which you're very aware of the distraction. But the 10-minute conversation is just extending the risk much further than the dialing, and it's also been suggested, well, isn't talking to a passenger the same exact thing? But passengers sort of famously are another set of eyes to judge the driving situation, give you feedback, and they more importantly seem to know when to stop talking, conversation suppression, and which the person on the remote phone obviously can't. And there's a lot of other things going on there that are different about that. So, hands-free is not brain-free. That's kind of just the thing that seems to be shown. I mean, all sorts of things change. Reaction times, placement on curves, up and down the line. So,
So I have a question. I was raised in Australia, and so I've observed driving on the left side and the right side and various other mannerisms. One of the things that I can't explain, and maybe you can, is why people stop so far from the line in this country not everybody, but some people will be so far back that they won't even trip the sensor. So you'll sit there and just wait until eventually the traffic light will time out, or they'll leave these incredible gaps between themselves and the car in front.
I'm thinking that may be a Seattle thing, but because in New York, I mean, the crosswalk is almost considered a part of the car infrastructure. I mean, we do not leave space. So, I mean, it is an interesting question. And a lot of people have asked me about left turns at intersections and whether you should creep out into the intersection to make the turn. And this was a novel question to me because I wasn't aware of any other way that it actually is done, that people, during red lights including. So I'm sorry, I don't have a more reasoned answer to your question, but...
Driving instructor one day said that if you stop and you can't see the line in front of you, that you're stopping too close or something?
Well, there's something about you should be able to see the wheels of the car in front of you and to not tailgate in that way, but in New York we don't do that either, so I don't know. But
I just want to note that I think some women's organizations were touting the distance while stopped at a light as a safety measure. So that's one take on that.
again, for oncoming vehicles or for...
Basically, someone yank on your door handle, you can hit the gas and you're in the car in front of you. But at least get away from the guy and make them go around.
I see. Okay.
All right, so I jaywalk a lot. Seattle people don't seem to jaywalk as much as the East Coast. Are we making our roads less safe by really enforcing that you follow the rules, you have crosswalks, and you only sort of have this automatic behavior going on when you're in the city?
Well, I mean, just to point to New York again as an example, the statistics on this were sort of surprising to me. It might just be an exposure issue, but more people are killed in New York crossing in the crosswalk with the signal than who do not. And obviously more people probably do cross during the signal, but it does raise the question of, does informed alert jaywalking actually, in some cases, a mid-block jaywalking is probably better statistically in New York than trying to cross at a intersection where there's two oncoming traffic streams. So, I'm definitely sort of pro jaywalking, and you can study the emergence of the word. And in the 1920s, it was sort of, there's a couple of good books on this, but it really wasn't always painted with quite the same pejorative brush, and it's definitely emerged as part of a campaign by AAA and some of the other auto groups back in the 1920s to sort of basically take over the urban streets and push pedestrians away. So,
the question from the back of the room made me think. You hear a lot of sort of speculation about differences in driving culture in different parts of the country. Are there any studies that actually bear this out?
There's a lot of it is sort of related to the work that's been done with time, how people measure time in different cities. So you will see a faster horn honking response at the classic applied psychology experiment is to park the car at a red light, wait till it turns green, and then measure who's behind you, and don't move the car, and then see who's behind you, see who honks, when they honk, how many times they honk. In New York, the joke is it's the fastest moment of recorded time, the smallest moment of recorded time from when the light changes to when the horn sounds behind you. So, there's always larger... I'm sorry, what was the original question again?
Are there studies that bear out that there really are significant differences in the way drivers behave in different parts of the country?
Only in those sorts of small ways, and in part because no one's sought to do massive research on this. But you definitely see, even with something like speed in Los Angeles, the speeds have increased so much on Los Angeles freeways that the highway capacity manual had to be revised to come up with a new prototypical volume, a maximum volume, because people were following so closely and driving so quickly. So, and this didn't come out of Topeka, Kansas, so you can see where the time pressure is the greatest. People have changed the behavior the most, but no one's done sort of the larger cultural studies. It's, so I'll try to go over here.
I guess the follow-up, cultural studies, but also, and I'm sure this is a very loaded topic as far as, gender differences and studies and a lot of sort of, I think, in US, a lot of their driving enthusiasts, look at Germany as the ultimate model of driving efficiency. Cultural studies across the globe, has that been done compared to, how culture US and sort of how it is versus Europe versus Asia, and driving behavior and statistical, obviously, effect on driving deaths?
Yeah, well, on a gender question, I mean, there's obviously been changes in behavior, but men still definitely dominate all kinds of categories like speeding tickets, fatalities, lack of seatbelt wearing, drinking while driving, sort of goes up and down the line. Germany, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Germany's an interesting place to drive for sure, and yeah, I think people do get hung up on the Autobahn a little too much, as kind of that informs the entire culture of Germany. But as people at the Driving Institute there told me that in many cities the speed limit is 30 kilometers per hour, and which is what 20, and quite rigidly enforced by red light cameras. So you kind of have these two Germanys of the unregulated Autobahn, a lot of which is actually regulated and has speed limits and congestion, and then these sort of quite, rigid behavior in cities. So there's, I don't know if that answers the question at all.
And I guess maybe what I was looking also fed out the effect of about drivers' education on that and behavior versus, culture combined with drivers' education, the country versus contrasting like U.S. obviously with the opposite side of the spectrum.
Well, it's interesting you say education, because I just took as an experiment a few months ago, it's not even in the book, but a British driving test as a bit of an experiment, because I'd heard a lot about the different, how tough it was in certain countries, and Germany was up there as far as having this legendarily difficult test with many questions, long in-car segments. I failed the British test, both the theoretical and the in-car part. There's obviously an issue with the different side of the road. That's my explanation, of course, and that's a classic behavior they find from people who fail their driving test. It's always the other road user. But as tough as Germany is, there's really been they haven't been able to make any correlation between any country's driving test and any further reduction in. I mean, the only thing that's helped in this country was basically taking younger people off the road with graduated licensing and shifting it to 18. No test has ever. No correlation has basically been established, and Britain keeps making their test harder, but their teenage fatality rate actually hasn't changed. So these are sort of questions that seem like it would make sense intuitively, but they haven't been able to find the effect.
There've recently been a bunch of articles about how there's a lot more bikes on the road because of the high cost of gas. I'm wondering if your research on the traffic flow touched on the interaction with bicycles and cars.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff. There's obviously been a lot of much touted kind of road rage, which I think we're almost having an echo of the car road rage from the 90s, which was really, I think, more of a reporting issue. There was more reporting of road rage than more road rage per se, and it's probably what's happening this time, where you have a car and a bike scrapping with each other in Portland, and it makes national news. I mean, so we're getting this sort of skewed vision of what's happening. But the ridership is definitely up, and we're going to probably see a rise. There's this sort of curve that's been identified, the SMED curve. As a nation gets motorized, the fatalities rise, and then there's sort of a national learning curve that kicks in, and it begins to drop after a while. And I almost think we're seeing that we may see that with bikes. I mean, it's been reported there's more fatalities, but there's kind of a safety in numbers effect that's been identified, that basically the more you have of one mode in any one place, the safer it becomes, which might be a visibility issue, it might be the norms changing, the laws might change. So, in New York, yeah, it's a toxic issue wherever you go. And I could go on, but there is some stuff about, I don't know. It probably doesn't answer your question, but it would probably take an hour to answer your question.
Are there any new solutions for how to integrate bikes and cars more effectively?
We have lanes in New York, but we have violations of those lanes every day. We have sharrows. I don't know if you have sharrows here. They're arrows placed in streets that don't have bike lanes to indicate that bikes are also allowed there. But I'm a little bit skeptical about sort of any pure engineering solution, because people have been shown not to respond very well to most signage at all. So in the back.
So I'm curious about sort of towards the beginning of your talk, when you were talking about how different driver behavior can increase or decrease freeway congestion. And some of the behaviors that decrease congestion, like merging late, are there efforts to educate people, or like change the driver's education manual to say this is how you should merge? Or
yeah, I mean, it's a good question. It's really hard, of course, because I mean the situation I was in was a construction zone. So I mean, you have these temporary situations, and they're all a little bit different. And but what's fascinating is that even when they do the system the right way and announce that people should really stay in both lanes all the way to the merge point, this happened in Minnesota. The DOT basically had to report that for some unknown reason, they said, drivers seemed unwilling to change their old behavior. So you still had all the same stuff going on. Trucks were blocking. People refused to get into the right-hand lane. It might have been sort of a Minnesota nice issue happening, where that seems too aggressive to them. And they actually surveyed all these people, and there was a real divide between people who were daily commuters, and they would act one way. People who were recreational tourists or other drivers would drive other ways. So, I'm not sure. It would require a massive education effort that probably safety is something to push for more and that kind of intervention. But I don't know. If drivers aren't really following the instructions on the road at that moment, I'm not sure how giving them lessons earlier on is going to actually last.
I read about no sign zones where the idea is you remove all the street signs and just leave people to use their own common sense. Did any of those work, and will we see more of it?
Yeah, in fact, there's a longer talk that has a bunch of stuff about that, and it's in Drachten in the Netherlands and a place called Boomte, Germany, and they've definitely worked against sort of all odds because they violate a lot of the kind of standard traffic engineering. Basically, there was a four-way signalized intersection in the Netherlands, which they were trying to improve the flow and also reduce crashes. So they, first of all, went to a roundabout, which would do that already anyway, but then they went further and just basically removed any markings. The only markings there were required by the police to indicate the direction of the roundabout, which most people know which direction to go in a roundabout. But over a year on, when we're starting to get past the potential novelty effects and all that kind of stuff, it's still, there wasn't a single fatality. I mean, the crashes have dropped. People are behaving differently. Cyclists are using signals as well as car drivers. And cyclists in the Netherlands don't use a lot of signals per se. So there's an idea that it's more sort of bottom-up traffic control is happening. And it seems to be safer, and it's trickling out to other places in London. And
does the throughput go there to the intersection?
No, not I mean, because it's a roundabout, it's already getting better throughput, and it's just slow and steady rather than kind of hurry up and wait with traffic lights.
I'm noticing in a few situations it seems like the posted speed limits, although they're designed to make people go slower and keep safe speeds, in the cases where the road isn't in the best condition, either it's traffic or rain or stuff like that, people will try to maintain the speed limit even when they shouldn't. Is there anything on that, like Mark, where the speed limits actually encourage people to go faster than they should?
Because of poor...
Because of the roads, I mean, speed limits are posted like if the road is in good condition, you should go 65.
Oh, yeah.
But if it's rainy or if it's traffic, you shouldn't go 65 because there's a lot of cars or because you can't brake as fast. But people seem to try to say that same speed because that's what it says to go.
Yeah, exactly. And those, I mean, that's the problem with signs, and they've tried to go with these dynamic signs that actually really change to the actual conditions of that day. And you see it with how many times you've driven over a bridge that says bridges freeze when wet or something, and it's the middle of July, and there's just so many useless signs out there that are just sort of, and the more signs you have, the less compliance you get. That's sort of one sort of iron rule in traffic engineering, it seems. But having dynamic, people respond more to information that's actually appropriate to the situation rather than, but I mean, this varies as well. They've done things with animated deer signs in Colorado because people famously do not adjust their behavior at all in the presence of deer crossing signs. There's no reduction in speed, crashes, really hard to tamper with. So they flashing animated signs during migratory times, and in fact the crash rate went up. So I mean, it's just, there's just... It's in the back.
There are some insurance companies offering to lower rates if they can electronically monitor your driving. What are they looking for?
Oh, the Progressive. Progressive is having pay-as-you-go insurance, which I think is a sort of a great, fascinating idea for those people who don't actually put on a lot of miles, ironically like myself, even though I've written this book. But there's other companies called DriveCam and some other companies which have essentially, I guess, sort of measuring G-forces of sudden acceleration, excessive, too much pressure to either side, and abrupt lane changing, hard braking. And so Progressive is going to tie some of those things in, as not only how many miles you drive, but the way you drive. And I guess some people might think of it as Orwellian, but if you can, this is voluntary, and you can actually lower your rate if you're a sort of reasonable driver. And they've also done studies at fleets that install these systems that measure those forces you're talking about, and they're really doing it for sort of fuel efficiency, and you get a little green light, it shows you that you're driving in a fuel efficient manner. You get a yellow light or red light but the people who have the most fuel efficient driving tend to work out the best on the safety aspect as well, which is kind of an interesting comparison. So
eventually mandate that all vehicles have to have that?
in this country I'm not sure, but but in Australia, they're talking about things like intelligent speed adaptation, where almost the old idea of a speed governor, which was sort of another battle that was lost in the 20s, where if you're driving in a city, you basically should not be allowed to go faster than 30 miles an hour. So intelligent speed adaptation would be tied into GPS and know where you are and what you should be driving, and taking the human factor out a little bit.
So, I've actually seen a documentary before talking about the German Autobahn and how it's actually one of the safest freeways, least mortalities and accident rates, and they don't have a speed limit, so people drive 200 miles per hour and it's not a problem. What studies have that reflected in the US? Because there are certain states in the US that don't have speed limit here as well. But this state, they are particularly strict with the speed limit. So can we just hear what's the thinking going on in that area?
Yeah, and first of all, there are often speed limits on the Autobahn, especially near cities. But one thing is, it is a different driving population. It's a wealthier driving population, Germany, and especially on those roads, which often cost money. And there are things like trucks are not allowed on Sundays. So the vehicle population is a little bit different. And there could be, I'm still sympathetic to the education angle. That I do have the suspicion that some other systems are done a little bit better on the driving education. But Germany is safer than the U.S., but the U.S. by one measure has now dropped to 16th in terms of global road safety, and Germany is sort of, I think, around 11 or 10. Germany is not necessarily the paragon of safety that Sweden, Denmark, Finland, the U.K., Canada has done quite well. So you can't really draw a direct comparison between the Autobahn and U.S. interstate highways. A lot of characteristics are different, but there is an argument that we do get a little bit obsessed about speed limits per se, and there's a lot of other factors going on there and what actually makes a safe road. But
So one of the social phenomena that you talked a little bit about, and I read the article in the Times, I don't know, a couple of months ago, you talked about the Disinhibition Effect, and you mentioned, I think you sort of alluded to it a little here with, what are the social effects of things like tinted windows or their opposites, not tinted windows, or smaller cars versus bigger cars, convertibles versus not? If you're out in the world, does that have an effect on the level to which you drive differently?
Yeah, I'm going with those horn honking studies, the famous ones. They found that people, in convertibles were less likely to honk, whether that was that their anonymity was reduced or they were just sort of in a better mood to begin with because they had the top down. It's hard to disentangle a lot of this stuff. But yeah, I do find that tinted windows. That's there's so many confounding factors. In New York, at least, I don't know. People who have tinted windows, it's not necessarily the driving population at large. Sometimes there's a different thing going on there too. So, The online disinhibition effect has just been shown to, in internet chat rooms, famously hostile places. You're signing in with a anonymous name, and you have no consequence for your actions. You can sign off in a hurry. No one knows you were there. No one knows what your behavior was. So it's been argued the same exact thing is happening in traffic, which is we have license plates which really don't tell us anything about one another, and all so much psychological work has shown removing that eye contact, not seeing someone, putting a hood on someone. Hooded hostages are more likely to be killed. I mean, there's all sorts of studies about just removing the famous shocking experiments from Milgram and others. So it's not hard to see how all this correlates to the road.
So I came from California, and one of the conditions I've noticed is people drive like they're an island, like they're completely separate. There's no consequence. There's no consequence to what they do, and they do the late merge. They even make eye contact, and you're like, you get in front of me, you pass 5 cars, you're not going to get to work any faster. In fact, you're going to upset everyone behind you. But the fact is you never see that car again. So that's just one of the things I've observed, and it's interesting to see because people go on like they don't care. I mean, they won't hit your car, or they won't put themselves in a position to, but it's quite good fun to see people, they drive white knuckle, and you're not going to get in front of me, and it's for what? For what? And you drive away, you slow down, let the person merge, who cares? I'll get to work, you'll get to work.
I couldn't agree more. But it begs the question of this feedback system. I mean, these things might be really sort of overloaded with complaints, and it might be too much. Sorry.
Just take yours off, put your neighbors on.
Well,
no one's gonna register like a compliment for you being. I think it's like much more likely someone's gonna register a complaint for you doing something that makes them mad than register a compliment for you being nice.
Exactly.
I think people are much more inclined to give negative feedback than positive feedback. So it's going to be the overwhelmingly negative.
Plus, if I see some guy on his phone and I think he's giving me negative feedback, I might call his number too.
This is a social phenomenon question, and I'd like to know if you have any answer to this as well, and that is that in this state, pedestrians are sacred cows. They are gods. They can walk in front of you at any time, and you as a motorist are wrong.
Yep.
What I want to know, this is my question, is does that have a detrimental effect? Is this a good idea gone bad? Because when they go to other countries or other places like New York, it's gone. Have they done any studies and said this was a great idea, but it's just wrong?
And you're talking about large crosswalks, or?
Anyway, you can legally walk across a freeway in this country, and the cars have to stop. In interstate. The car will get booked. Pedestrian has absolute right of way.
No.
Maybe you get a ticket, but the cars will stop you.
Well, it's certainly trying to avoid you.
Yeah.
They just don't want to pay for it.
But I can walk across 148 right now, and the cars would politely stop for me. And if a policeman saw a car not stop while I was crossing, they'd book the car, not me.
Yeah, well, that's what the problem in the U.S. Each state has a different set of laws going on. So.
These people go to a different place.
That's almost beyond study. I mean, no one's done that, but I mean, there's all sorts of weird.
I think that's more because it's a litigious society. In the UK, you're not going to sue anybody, so you watch out for yourself.
In France, you'd get mowed over in a heartbeat.
Well, there's a famous question on the French driving test. If you're driving along and you see a woman pushing her pram into the middle of the street, should you A, slow down, or B, speed up to send her a message? And the correct answer on the test is actually B. So there's some, the strange dynamics going on in the French driving test. But now, in the studies on car-pedestrian interactions, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. It's fascinating. Sometimes pedestrians not making eye contact actually works better. It's sort of just a blind man's bluff. I mean, their brinksmanship sort of works best, and people's interpretation of the law is actually often quite different. In Chicago, they've been doing stings in the crosswalk that cars have been violating pedestrians' rights of way so often that the police have had to do undercover crosswalk busts. And well, and they interview the drivers, and the drivers are clueless as to what the actual system was. So, you know, I mean, we're... So,
if you compared and contrasted driver behavior between regular drivers and professional drivers like race car drivers.
There's a famous study, which as I know has been yet to be replicated from the 1970s, looking at stock car racers and their off-track records, and they actually did not do very well at all with either crashes or violations. And so obviously the risk-taking, you know, sorts of things come up. And this leads to another issue, which is the advanced driving schools, the high performance driving, et cetera. And that's another thing that the studies are a little bit mixed on, but sort of begs the question, was it better to get people to steer your way out of skids, avoidance maneuvers, or better not to have gotten into that situation in the first place? So that's kind of the classic divide with that. And so. Okay.
Seems as if the technology, the engineering, and the cultural issues are so intertwined. I'm wondering if in your studies you came across any examples of a technological or an engineering implementation in a particular culture that worked to increase traffic flow or improve safety or whatever that was adopted in a different culture and had either no effect or the opposite effect because the people reacted so differently.
Geez, that's a really good question, but I'm not... I mean, a lot of the stuff that's been transferred over is just basic hardcore stuff like divided highways, which sounds like a ridiculous concept, but, going back to the 50s when we didn't have, sort of cushions on the front of guardrails, I mean, just basic sort of engineering stuff, but nothing springing to mind on an engineering solution that failed in one country and succeeded in...
So basically, we've got a whole bunch of different streams of development and the opportunity for cross-pollinization, it sounds like it's fairly limited because it's such a uniquely tailored solution.
Yeah, but in general, highway interchanges the world over do look pretty alike. I mean, they're all working from the same book. There's no sort of special, Chinese interchange or, it might be different stages of development, it might be stuck behind a little bit, but, So I'm sorry, nothing springs to mind.
From all these studies, is there a trend coming out? So what is the most effective, improvement per dollar spent? Is it in-vehicle technology? Is it driver education? Is it infrastructure? Is it a combination of both? I mean, at one point, obviously zero fatality is not a realistic goal, right? So you will probably want to increase throughput, and you might have to actually have increased fatalities rates, but looking at social offsets, right? Are people looking at all these factors combined? Especially as population is growing, as infrastructure is getting old, as technology, as we're driving faster, sort of information's coming at us faster.
Well, I mean, Sweden does have a 2020 zero fatality goal. I mean, they'll probably get somewhat close, but I guess what you said, I mean, infrastructure and technology are probably the best things that money can be spent on. I mean, the driver behavior part is a little bit trickier to work out. I mean, we still have, roughly half of our fatalities related to lack of seatbelt wearing. I mean, it's sort of shocking the number of people who die simply by not wearing a seatbelt. And there's the argument that they might be driving in a safer manner because they feel more risk, and actually it turns out that they're the ones getting in the most severe crashes to begin with, so they're actually looking for more risk. But so yeah, I mean, this on a per dollar basis, I haven't seen a good way to analyze that, but hardcore infrastructure engineering is the thing that everyone has to sort of obey and pay attention to, and again, just on highways, so, just simple things, but again, I haven't seen that figure, so I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.